So at the beginning of the book of Acts, in Acts 1:8, Christ promises the disciples power from the Holy Spirit so that they could be his witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. We've hit on this theme over and over again about how Acts is about how the church is growing to the ends of the earth as a movement that's empowered by the Holy Spirit. Now, it's interesting to think when we think about that phrase, right? That Jesus says, I will promise you power from the Holy Spirit. Right? And this isn't just a promise for the disciples in that immediate context. It's also a promise to us as the church, that the church is empowered by the Holy Spirit as well. But to be quite frank, there have been a lot of times throughout this pandemic that I have felt powerless. I'm unsure of what I can do in the face of COVID. I'm unsure of what I can do in the face of racial injustice in our country. I'm unsure of what I can do in the face of just getting through my day-to-day tasks sometimes. Right? And yet the key promise in this book about the early church is that you and I are empowered for life by the Holy Spirit. Now, we're picking up our story in Acts chapter 24. If you remember last time, Paul was on trial after being wrongfully arrested in Jerusalem. Right? In Acts chapter 24 through 26, Paul is put on trial 3 times before the Roman governors Festus, Felix, and the Jewish king Agrippa II. Now, what a picture this is. We have Paul, former persecutor of the church, missionary of the church, turned missionary of the church, now as a prisoner giving testimony to Roman politicians and Jewish kings of the day. And yet we still have to remember Christ's words at the beginning of Acts, that Paul is empowered by the Holy Spirit to be a witness for the gospel. Right? So as Paul is standing before these political leaders in chains, literally on trial, according to Christ, Paul is the one in power because he's giving testimony to the Spirit. Oftentimes, I think we tend to measure ourselves how we're doing by the world standards, right? If somebody asks you, how are you doing? We might respond, school has been really, really tough lately, grade-wise. Extracurriculars, all those activities I'm in with my friends, whatever it is, they're just really piling on. Just feel really, really busy right now, like I've taken on too much. And it's almost like we know that we're spiritual beings, that we're created in God's image, that we're saved through the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. But then we continue to measure our lives according to worldly and earthly means. And yet here in the life of Paul, we see an example of Paul being the one empowered, even though he's the one in trial and in chains. It's in his last trial with King Agrippa that Paul then shows what it means to be a witness that's empowered by the Holy Spirit, even when it seems like you're in this position of powerlessness. What he does is really interesting. He tells the story of how he came to know Christ. His story as a former persecutor turned missionary, turned church planner, turned now prisoner, standing trial, right? But then he also proclaims the resurrection. We are in Acts chapter 26, verses 22 through 23. To this day, Paul is talking, to this day I have had the help that comes from God, and so I stand here testifying both to small and great, saying nothing but what the prophets and Moses said would come to pass, that the Christ must suffer, and that by being the first to rise from the dead, he would proclaim light both to our people and to the Gentiles. How is it that Paul can stand before the most powerful leaders of his day and give testimony to who Christ is? One is the Holy Spirit, that power that Jesus promised to believers for a specific purpose, which is proclaiming Christ. But that power comes from Christ's death and resurrection. See, Christ's death is the ultimate reversal of how we envision power and success and what it means to thrive. We often seek ways to sort of elevate ourselves. We want to be top of our class in school. We want to go to the best college as we can. We want to get the best jobs we can, and those are all worthy pursuits. It's good to do your best in school. It's good to go to a good college. But when we look at the life of Christ, it's about Christ coming down to us. It's about Christ having relationships with sinful humanity and then surrendering his life for sinful humanity. And now you have Paul, who was a former religious spiritual leader within Judaism, now, former persecutor of the church, now stands persecuted as Christ did, proclaiming Christ and his resurrection. Right? That is what the Spirit has empowered Paul to do, to take on Christ in his ministry. And the last two chapters of Acts, Paul is they're kind of weird. Paul goes to Rome, he's sent as a prisoner, and he's going to testify before Caesar. Right? Paul is going to Rome, and he's going to proclaim the gospel and the resurrection of Jesus, where he's going to be imprisoned in Rome. And yet the ship crashes, and Paul is among these shipwrecked soldiers and prisoners. And once again, he begins to proclaim the gospel and give testimony to Christ and who he is. And so what we see as Paul has proclaimed Christ to Roman governors, to Jewish kings, Roman soldiers, and prisoners, that Paul is fulfilling the mission of the church that Christ gave at the beginning of Acts. That to all people, at all levels of societies, in all culture, the message has always been the same. Christ is resurrected and is Lord. And that's the power that the Holy Spirit gives us, is to proclaim Christ and who he is and how he's working in our lives, not just to our immediate circle or people who always look and act and speak like us, but to Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. Thanks for listening, guys, and we can't wait to see you again soon.